I think it's really important that people recognize that it's grief. Even if you feel super relieved and happy to be leaving your marriage and know it's the right decision, you're still grieving something, something that was, something that you wish it was, something you thought would become in the future. And knowing that and realizing that you're going constantly through the cycle of grief and it's not linear. So you're moving through feeling angry, feeling sad, feeling like the what ifs, which in the cycle of grief is called bargaining, right? What if I did this differently? What if they did this differently, etc. Check in with yourself. How are you feeling? What's going to be in your best interest? That's really key to moving forward, and people often lose sight of that.
Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Katherine Miller. This is where we have honest, thoughtful conversations about divorce, the emotional, financial, legal, and family questions no one prepares you for. From deciding whether to separate, to navigating the process with dignity, to rebuilding what comes next, Divorce Dialogues is here to help you find clarity, perspective, and a better way forward. The physical feeling of the anxiety, the hypervigilance, inability to sleep or to focus, the feeling that your nervous system is constantly activated. And when people are in that state for long periods of time, it becomes really difficult to think clearly or communicate effectively or make grounded decisions, which of course is important because divorce requires you to be online for all of these things. So what this conversation really is about is understanding that divorce isn't just a legal or logistical process or financial. It's also a psychological and physiological experience. And when people understand what's actually happening in their minds and their bodies, they're often able to navigate the process with a little more self-awareness and a little more compassion for themselves and a much greater capacity to respond intentionally instead of reactively. My guest today, Alyssa Mairanz, works with people at exactly that intersection. Alyssa is a licensed therapist and a founder of Empower Your Mind Therapy. And in this conversation, we're talking about what's actually happening in your brain and in your body during divorce and how to navigate it and maybe even understand it better. This is a conversation about emotional survival, resilience, and what it takes to actually move forward. Welcome, Alyssa, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So when someone is going through a divorce, what's actually happening psychologically and emotionally beneath the surface?
So it's going to slightly differ or greatly differ for so many people. And that's why I think this conversation is so important. Like you mentioned, self-awareness. And what's going on is it activates your nervous system, like you said, and brings up a lot of emotion that's not even just about the divorce. It brings up all your feelings about where your life is in general, how you feel about how you were in your marriage, how you feel about how you're handling your marriage, all your relationships. And that just becomes super overwhelming and really hard to navigate.
What do you think are some of the most common emotional patterns or responses that you see in divorcing people?
Anger and shame are the two biggest emotions that come up, and they mix together, where people don't always really know that they're feeling the shame because it can often be easier to feel the anger. And there's a lot of anger and shame around themselves, right? Like feeling I failed, I didn't do everything correctly, what could I have done differently? And then that turns into anger at themselves and at their partner as well for their role in everything that led to the divorce.
In my experience, and tell me if this resonates with you, when people are divorcing or they're angry at themselves, let's say they had an affair or they did something that they shouldn't have done and they've confessed it now, and they're feeling really angry and shameful at themselves, that after a period of time, which is usually about 3 months, that anger at themselves turns into anger at the other person if they feel repetitively shamed by the other person. So like the person is just like, this is your fault, you're destroying our family, you did this to us, that ultimately they start to feel like, well, you know what, I wasn't alone in this thing. And then the anger to the other person starts to show up.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. And at the same time, it also happens in the opposite, right? Like, let's say you're not the one that decided to end the marriage, per your example. And so you might start with anger at your partner and feel all of that. And then as that subsides, start feeling anger and shame at yourself. And it's also about how other people react, not just you and your partner. So you might have friends, family members feeding that shame or just giving their opinions. Even just saying, I knew you shouldn't have married this person when they think that's validating is super invalidating and does not help at all. And so it's just a lot of voices in your head that just people cycle back between feeling towards themselves the anger and their partner, and it's not linear. So it just becomes this big mess of emotions that feels like a roller coaster.
Yeah. I want to make a little like tangential comment here about what you said. When somebody says, hoping to be supportive of their friend or family member, I knew you shouldn't have married that person. Can you just explain to the listeners why that's not a helpful thing to say?
The person themselves is probably thinking that in the same words, different words. They're already judging themselves of, I made this decision, it didn't work out, now I'm in this mess. To hear someone else say that they knew that they never liked this person is just reinforcing that they should have known themselves, and also can lead to anger at the person saying, well, you never said this to me before. Why didn't you tell me this before I married them? And so those two things can be coming up, which just doesn't help processing all the other emotions you're feeling.
Yeah. And I want to give some other, this is from my personal, not professional experience. But when I got divorced, a bunch of people would say to me, well, I didn't want to tell you this at the time, but your ex-husband was an ass for this or a jerk for that, all this other stuff. I'm like, well, that's not particularly helpful. But I also thought, I don't think that marrying my first husband was a mistake. It was something that happened, and it was an experience. I got two fabulous children out of it. I learned a lot, and I apply a lot of what I learned in that marriage and in the divorce process into the work I do today. And I'm incredibly grateful to my, quote, failed marriage for really creating who I am. So I think if someone were to say to me, I know it was a mistake, I would disagree. It wasn't a good marriage, but it wasn't a mistake.
And that's the goal, right? For people to get to that point around the divorce, just like any life experience, right? You want to learn from it and accept it. And so whether you're feeling that in that moment already or not, someone telling you that is not going to be helpful, as you know.
Yeah, it's the opposite of affirming, whatever that would be. So talk to us a little bit about how stress and emotional dysregulation impact decision-making during this time or any time, really.
When you're having such high emotional distress, you're not grounded enough to really think through your decisions, and it ends up being a lot of things out of impulsiveness or pettiness rather than thinking what is going to help me and be in my best interests. Especially if you're dealing with anger at your partner, you can make a lot of decisions out of that, not looking at the big picture. And so when you make those kind of decisions, it leads to consequences that aren't really benefiting you. And that just feeds into this emotional cycle that you're already going through.
Yeah, I think people really discount the connection between the mind and the body, which always is kind of an interesting thing because the mind is part of the body. The way that we think and the physiology of how the brain works with hormones and all kinds of other things make us a lot less independent, perhaps, of our physical state than we originally or might have been led to believe.
Yeah. And actually, when your nervous system is activated, that activates your fight or flight response, which people often only associate with fear, being in a dangerous situation, right? But what it is when you're activated like that in this kind of situation, you're vacillating between acting in that fight, angry, or only focusing on let me move forward, ignoring the fact that you do have to process emotions, or going into the flight and just retreating and not wanting to deal with anything and not wanting to deal with your emotions. And either of those extremes really get in the way of processing and moving forward in a way that's going to actually land you in a positive place.
I know that you specialize in dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. Can you tell us what that is and how it helps people find tools to help themselves during emotionally overwhelming moments?
So the D, dialectical, in DBT stands for this idea that we're constantly balancing things that seem opposite, like the example I just gave when you're navigating fight or flight, or commonly emotion versus logic, and how they're both true at the same time, but accepting that and understanding that really leads to a lot of emotional turmoil. And so the goal is to figure out how to meet them in the middle so you're working with both truths. And how we do that, a big part of that is really identifying emotions, letting yourself experience them, validating them, and then you can go into change after that.
So I love what you're saying there, Alyssa, about that, because I think that with the emotions that we do not experience pleasurably, what the Buddhists call afflictive emotions, right? No one wants to feel that way. I mean, I guess anger can be very energizing and charging, but no one wants to feel anxious or sad really for terribly long. So I think what you're saying is leaning into where you are and trying to understand why you're there is the first step rather than trying to make yourself feel better.
Exactly. Because if you're trying to push it away and not feel it, or you're too much into problem solving so you don't acknowledge it, it's still there. You're not changing the fact that you're not feeling that. And so eventually it will come out, and in a way that's not in your control. And the goal is to be in control of your emotions so you can act in ways that are going to benefit you and be effective.
Divorce Dialogues is brought to you by Miller Law Group. We believe divorce isn't just a legal process, it's a human transition. At Miller Law Group, we help people navigate divorce with dignity, clarity, and respect, focusing on conversations that lead to better outcomes for families. Learn more at miller-law.com. Okay, so I can imagine we've got listeners out there going, well, that sounds great, Alyssa, but what can I do in the moment to stop that from happening? Because it really feels crappy.
Definitely. It's not easy. And that's why DBT has a whole set of skills. And some of the main ones to start with are grounding yourself. So when you're feeling really highly stressed, your brain doesn't even know how to shut down. And so you consciously have to try something like deep breathing or counting or splashing cold water on your face. Just something to activate yourself in a way that makes you go, stop, I need to think about this. And once you're there, then you can lead into other skills. And I think one of the biggest ones that helps is something called check the facts. And what you're doing is you're asking yourself, what are you feeling? What is your urge to act? And is that actually going to benefit you? And so when you can answer all those questions, you can then determine actually how to best move forward.
I don't want to ask you to betray a client confidentiality, but can you give an example of how that has worked for someone or how it might work for someone in the moment?
The example I like to give, because it's so relevant to today's day and age, is in this texting culture. You don't really know tone when someone's texting you, and we read so much into the written word. So many people are expressing, and this definitely happens in divorce as well, when you're probably messaging a lot via text or email, and you get a message and you're reading into it and you have a certain reaction, right? So let's say you're supposed to meet a friend and they text you and tell you that they're actually not able to make it and you'll find another time to reschedule. Someone might take that as, oh no, they're mad at me, they don't want to meet me. And then it becomes this whole mess of emotions and you're spiraling into, why are they mad at me? What did I do? Oh, no one likes me. And it could just be this whole production. But if you take a step back, ground yourself, and you ask yourself, okay, what actually was said in this message? What facts point to what's going on? And the facts are, they just said they had a conflict and they mentioned I need to reschedule. And when you can look at that, you say, so what's the best way to move forward? Not lashing out at them, yelling at them, not sitting there ruminating over what a terrible person you are and no one likes you, right? The best thing to do is respond, find a time to reschedule, and then put something else in your time that's going to be more productive. Even if it's just, relaxing, watching TV, take that time for yourself.
Again, I don't want to go too terribly off track here, but I think the worst thing is when someone just doesn't respond. And I find it's really different when that happens with my children. When it happens with my children, then I feel free to nag. Question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. But if it's my friend, I don't. And then I could just worry about it. Is she mad at me? Is, this and that and the other thing. So what do you propose someone does to help themselves in the way that you suggested in that circumstance?
Yeah, again, it's checking the facts, right? Something I think we have to realize, and is a big thing in this texting culture, is not everyone's available all the time, right? So it's very possible you message someone and they're busy. And so you need to give them time to be able to respond. It can also be they are really stressed and they saw the message and just don't have the energy to respond. And everyone goes through that, yet people take it very personally when it happens to them, right? And so the key is not making assumptions, recognizing that it's okay that people aren't immediately available to you and waiting to then see what they do respond. And if it's this consistent, like some people are not great texters, that can be a conversation between friends or parents and children or whatever the relationship is.
That sounds very, very thoughtful. So, how do you think that someone can tell the difference when they're reacting emotionally versus responding intentionally?
It's a great question because I think people often lose sight of that, and it could be so easy to think you're responding intentionally and you're not. One of the main signs is checking in your body, right? Are you feeling really worked up? Are you feeling pounding in your chest, tight stomach? Check that you're not tight overall, right? And so you can first calm your body down because that helps you respond more intentionally. And then the next thing is go through these steps of like check the facts that I mentioned. If you are giving yourself time to think through, that's how you know you're responding intentionally. And if you're not in a place where you can go through that cycle or you can act on the outcome you come to, that's a sign that you are still so much in emotion mind. And that's where you go into more stress management, grounding techniques that help you get to a place where you can respond in a way that's helpful.
Yeah, so let's put together these last two conversations a little, because when you're getting divorced, the other person is mad at you. You can just pretty much almost guarantee that on some level there's conflict there. So their response could be aggressive and they could mean to hurt you. They might not, because I think that people feel hurt more often than the other person intends to hurt them. And still, it's important to respond intentionally and not reactively, right? And so what can someone do in that moment when they know the other person is saying something that they either it's really obvious on the face of it, or there's sort of an implicit message, or they feel that there is, to not get to that emotionally reactive place in responding. They just work through it. And I say that I have a rule for myself, is that if my heart rate is elevated, I will not hit send. I have to wait till a moment when I can feel myself physically calm and say, this still makes sense to me to send with my heart rate at my normal level. And then I can send it, which is just kind of physical check-in. Is there something like that or something else that you think would be helpful for the listeners to know about responding intentionally?
Yeah, it's a great question because that comes up in so many contexts where you're right, the other person is mad, especially in a divorce case. And so I like what you do, taking that minute to know, like, okay, I need to check in with my body. And then the next key thing is what happens is when they're thinking, okay, this other person is mad at me, and it's true. Often, whether consciously or often subconsciously, you're taking that into a self-judgment. And so you're not even really reacting just to their anger, you're reacting to your interpretations of what that means about you and your identity. And so taking a minute to separate that and know, okay, they could be mad at me. If you did something you feel like understandably, they're mad at, you can say, doesn't mean I'm a bad person. We all make mistakes. And if not, you can separate and say they might feel this way. It doesn't mean that that's accurate from an objective standpoint. And make sure you're not taking this to a deeper level of what it means about you and your judgments of yourself or how other people see you. And then the next key thing, I think this really is the hugest point, is you really have to make sure you're acting in a way that benefits you. And so when you're going through a divorce and there's all that anger, it can be so easy to make decisions that just to spite the other person. And really, that doesn't actually benefit you at all, and it just ignites more anger, and then the two of you can end up in this cycle. And so remembering you can't control the other person. They have to deal with their own emotions. They have to deal with what they're doing to move forward. And what you're doing is constantly asking yourself, what is really important to me? What is going to benefit me? What is going to help me? And how do I act in ways that are going to facilitate that?
Yeah, I think that's really great, Alyssa, because I think that when you, not you personally, but someone is getting divorced, and they are acting in reaction to the other person, the things they ask for are because it's important to the other person or because the other person said or did or behaved in a certain way, right? Then the frame of the conversation and the frame of the negotiation is around the other person, and it's not around you. But if you really think, all right, they can do them, right? And it's not that it doesn't impact me. Of course it does. But if I'm thinking about it, my focus is on the impact the other person is having on me, then it's still on the other person rather than on my goals for myself, my family, and my future. And to really focus on that, at least in the beginning, at least as much as you are focusing on the other person, is much more likely to get you to a result that works than one that is come to reactively.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point.
Are there some exercises or something like that that you have your clients go through to try to sort those things out? Whether or not it's physical awareness or journaling exercise, meditation, breathing, something that can help the listeners just sort of start to think, oh, this thing could work for me too.
Like I mentioned before, it starts with just doing something that's going to physically ground you. So any kind of mindfulness technique, deep breathing, anything that's going to tell you, stop, let me think about this. And then there's something called in DBT the model of emotions. And it's basically questions you ask yourself to get a picture of what's going on and get to all these answers that we're trying to get to. And so you take a step back and you ask yourself, what is the emotion? Identifying that is really important. And people often just feel negative, don't feel great, and aren't really saying, let me put a label to this. But that knowledge is really powerful. So you put the emotion, then you ask yourself, how is that making you feel physically? Right? Check in on all your physical responses. If you know how you generally respond to stress, definitely look at that first. The next thing that often gets really overlooked is ask yourself, what thought processes is this creating, right? What bigger judgments, bigger assumptions is this leading you to about yourself, about your partner, about your children, if that's relevant to your divorce, and identifying all those pieces so that you have the information you need to then move forward. And once you have that, you then look at, okay, what is my gut telling me to do? What is my impulsiveness telling me to do? And what would those consequences be? What would that actually lead to long term? How is that going to impact me? And then you can parse out what is going to be helpful, what is not going to be helpful, and then move yourself towards the helpful path.
Yeah, that's really great. It's my observation that one of the biggest challenges about divorce is not so much about what happened, but what it means for who each person is, what their identity is, right? And when we marry and we partner and we create family together, we create a kind of a shared identity. And when we start to pull that shared identity apart, it can be really hard for someone, especially if they didn't want the divorce, to form a sense of identity separate from the other person that isn't in reaction to the break. And so how do you help clients or patients proactively and positively rebuild their sense of identity after like a divorce or another relationship rupture?
So the key there is, again, checking in with yourself. And so it's about, first off, what you mentioned I really liked. Instead of looking at it as a failure, look at it as a learning experience and what you can take moving forward. And then connecting it back to DBT, it's really also about this dialectical balance of don't feel like you have to hold on to anything about how you were in the marriage, and also don't feel like you have to let it go. And that might be trial and error. You might have to try something to see if it works, to say, oh, you know what, this actually suits me as a single person, or this doesn't. And letting yourself actually evaluate that and assess and find what really works for you. And I think it's also important to remember everyone always constantly needs to do that as things evolve, right? And so looking at it as a great opportunity to do that rather than staying stuck in something that's not working for you in terms of your identity, how you operate day to day, what's going on, and let yourself find what's working now.
What do you wish that more people understood about their own emotional experience during divorce?
I think it's really important that people recognize that it's grief. Even if you feel super relieved and happy to be leaving your marriage and know it's the right decision, you're still grieving something that was, something that you wish it was, something you thought would become in the future. And knowing that and realizing that you're going constantly through the cycle of grief, and it's not linear. So you're moving through feeling angry, feeling sad, feeling like the what ifs, which in the cycle of grief is called bargaining, right? What if I did this differently? What if they did this differently, etc. And then acceptance, right? And it's going to keep cycling. So sometimes people are like, oh, I feel good today, I finally moved on, and get really thrown off when all of a sudden they're back into anger or to sadness or to the bargaining or whatever that may be. And so knowing it's going to be this up and down piece, and you just have to take it day by day and check in with yourself. How are you feeling? What's going to be in your best interest? That's really key to moving forward, and people often lose sight of that.
I'm going to ask you probably an impossible question, but how long, or what's the range, like how long should somebody expect this to take normally?
Yeah, that is an impossible question. It differs for everyone, but I also really like that you asked it, because the key there is never, right? But not in a negative way. The thing is, this will always be something you take with you. And it's important to always look at it as in the way that we framed in this conversation today, because you can be 10 years down the line and you can be okay. And one day something could happen. Like you can get a text from someone that you haven't spoken to since you were married. You can run into your ex, anything. And then you can have this brief moment of feeling upset again or sad or whatever it may be in processing. So it's not that you're always going to be really struggling and it's always going to be hard. It's just knowing that there's no right amount of time to get to the point where you are pretty leveled around it, and know that even with that, something could happen and you're thinking about it again and processing. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's just going to be a brief moment in time.
You know, Alyssa, now that we're talking about it, I realize this just happened to me recently. I've been remarried for 27 years. So it's like, I just want you to know my divorce happened a few minutes ago, right? And I just learned something that my ex-husband did when my daughter was in high school, where he wasn't, in my view, supervising her. And I was all of a sudden furious, 15 years later, furious that he had done this and with nothing to do. And the most frustrating thing, because what am I going to do? Call him up and say, you're an ass, you did this? I mean, no, there's no point in that. And he probably wouldn't take my call anyway. So like, yeah, it can like really, it can just like, and I'm still a little annoyed about it. It's like, okay, but it's way in the distant history. And so I just need to let that go. So I think that's good advice. So for parents who are listening to the podcast, how do you think that managing their own mental health impacts their children going through the divorce process?
Kids really feed off their parents' energy, no matter what the age. So even you can have adult children in their 20s, 30s, they're going to feel the impacts of what their parents are feeling and what's going on, and especially based on reactions, right? So if there's a lot of anger and it's being geared towards each other and there's constant yelling or fighting or name calling or even just like bashing the other person to the children, or even if you're trying not to do that, kids pick up on this, adults pick up on it, and it's really going to impact how they're feeling about what's going on and how they manage their own emotions around it. And so it's really important to just be aware of that and go back to that acting intentionally. Really think about how you can best proceed forward, because that's going to ultimately be in your children's best interest as well.
There's always two questions that I like to ask at the end of the podcast. And one is, I call it the reframe. And that is that what is one shift in thinking, reframe, that can help someone navigating divorce differently?
I think we kind of touched on this before, and it's about your mindset around it, right? Not looking at it as a failure and looking at it as any other stressful event that you've been through in your life. And knowing, you know what, I went through this stress and I got over it. And I know that I can handle this. And taking it as a learning experience. Because if you just sit in the grief of it and just being upset that it didn't work out, or of the choices you made, or not wanting to move on, or judging yourself thinking you're a failure, you're gonna just get stuck in that. And it's not really gonna help you make those intentional choices.
What is one piece of advice that you wish everyone knew before, or at least in the middle of going through a divorce?
Cut yourself some slack. It's really a strong decision. It shows your strength when you're able to make such a tough choice. So many people stay in marriages that really aren't working and could even be toxic for all the wrong reasons, right? And so knowing that you're being really strong to make this decision, and you're going to feel angry, you're going to feel all these negative things, and you probably even trying to act intentionally will make choices that you're going to ultimately regret. And knowing that that's okay and that's part of the process, and just practicing that self-compassion is really important.
I love it. Cut yourself some slack is true. And I think it's true. People stay in marriages for all the wrong reasons. And sometimes people leave for all the wrong reasons too. But figuring out what's the right reason and what's not the right reason is something you might be able to get some help with.
Exactly.
Alyssa, thank you so much for being my guest on Divorce Dialogues. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
If this conversation was helpful, share it with someone who might need it. And if you're navigating divorce yourself, you'll find more resources and episodes at miller-law.com. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.